and he did so
the
while he.
the intention is also that you're not also going to be using it as a military base. Yes, it's supposed to be
Exactly,
like
yeah, you're giving it
it's
up.
freeing itself from the conflict, right?
So yeah, in the Italian campaign of World War II, this was a huge part of kind of this thing. It's a much more delicate situation because you have Rome, but you also have the Vatican, and technically both the Axis and the Allies agreed not to hit the Vatican. So both sides were also like, "Oh, we should probably not fight in Rome," and they kind of both agreed to this. It is a rather weird story, but Rome was declared an open city eventually too. So it's a similar situation, a little bit more complex, mind you. But MacArthur also instructed Brereton to send the remaining B-17s out of harm's way. He said, just go south. You can do me much more good with the bombers you have left if you just go south. So he does that. And as he did so, he finally said, let's put War Plan Orange 3 into effect. Something that should have been put into effect like December the 8th. But anyways,
So like two
75,000
weeks
troops
ago.
comprising 15,000. Exactly. So you got 75,000 troops, 15,000 of them Americans, 60,000 Filipinos, along with what was 26,000 refugees. All are fleeing to Bataan now. It's a logistical nightmare. So you look at the Philippines, let me zoom out. This is just showing like Luzon and a little bit of the south here, but you have to imagine all the other islands, they're screwed. There's no moving outside of Luzon. The main chunk of this island is where there's actually retreating. But all of across this island are units with war materials. It's a logistical nightmare. Should have never happened because War Plan Orange 3 should have been implemented at the start. Situation was quite dire. Caught all the forces in massive pincers everywhere. Brigadier General Charles Drake's supply units, because he's in this poor individual's in charge of the logistics here. He's desperately scrambling to move tons of food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, everything he can to the Bataan Peninsula. And he's being attacked by air, by Japanese forces, by armored forces. He himself lacks vehicles to do this. He has insufficient personnel to be able to move all this. And he has the worst thing of all, a lack of time. So, Wainwright's North Luzon force, the main one at this point, trying to delay the enemy, fought wherever they could to delay the Japanese advances. And they established 5 delaying positions in central Luzon. So if you look over here on the map, D1 to D5 are those delaying positions where he's trying to hold them back. But the Japanese are also coming from the south, and that's where Parker's men are running for their lives. As a result of all the chaos, only a fraction of the much needed war materials would actually reach the peninsula. The pre-invasion construed plan for the fortified defenses of Bataan was, pretty much neglected through all this. MacArthur and his staff ultimately abandoned their headquarters and they sailed across the bay to Corregidor Island, where there's a much more formidable HQ. The Filipino president, Manuel Quezon, who was suffering from tuberculosis at the time, made the painful decision to accompany MacArthur, fearing for the fate of his people. Because now he looks like a collaborator. He could have maybe pitched this as, we'll just throw our lot in with the Japanese. The Japanese were actually grooming Quezon with the by just stipulating they're like, oh, you're going to be part of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. To which Quezon said, I never knew this was a thing. I didn't agree to be part of this. The Japanese are like, well, you are. You're part of this, as they did. So yeah,
It kind of like he's like that Rogue One where Gina was like, "Congratulations, you have been liberated," even though she had no
exactly.
idea
That's
she
the
was being
meme.
liberated.
It's exactly that meme. Yeah. Allied forces, they're traveling north on Route 3 in long, disorganized convoys, trucks, buses, jeeps, and ox carts and stuff. They're sharing the road with thousands of civilians who are fleeing for their lives on foot. War Plan Orange 3 required that the Bataan Peninsula be stocked with sufficient food and supplies to enable 43,000 troops to endure a Japanese siege estimated for about 6 months. However, they would have enough provisions for about a 30-day siege because of MacArthur. One thing in favor of the Americans was the Japanese were actually caught very much off guard by this retreat. Coordinated strafing attacks by the Japanese air forces on the densely packed roads to Bataan could have been an absolute massacre, but they weren't. For the first time throughout the entire campaign, there was actually not many enemy planes overhead, for the most part. Moreover, the Japanese had opportunities to destroy key bridges along the way to Bataan, potentially trapping most of the American forces fleeing for their lives, but they failed to do so. To complicate matters, MacArthur assigned Major General Parker, the commander of the Southern Luzon Force, to lead the Bataan defenses, and they allocated the Southern Luzon Force to Brigadier General Albert Jones. Jones immediately devised a plan to delay a potential Japanese advance through the mountains towards Manila, while concurrently conducting an aggressive withdrawal into Bataan. But before this consolidation, the Japanese, under Commander Mayoka, had disembarked at 3 different locations in southern Luzon. Well, Major General Parker had ordered the 1st and 51st Divisions to move to Legazpi to counter the invasion, but he now had to watch commands to coordinate the retreat to Bataan. So you have to imagine he is trying to delay the Japanese and attack them with counterattacks, but he's also trying to withdraw, do a fighting withdrawal for that matter, all of his men to Bataan. And if you look at the map and you look where he's going, it's kind of a nightmare because you can easily get trapped. Now, in southern Luzon, the 3 Japanese military groups were invading, consolidating their positions to advance on Manila because that's their objective. With War Plan Orange 3 now suddenly initiated, MacArthur ordered Jones to collaborate effectively with Wainwright for both of them to retreat to Bataan. If one retreated too quickly, you basically screwed over the other, as you can imagine. Jones established his main defensive line in the town of Los Banos, as his Filipino forces were heavily pressed back by the Japanese at the Legazpi area. Meanwhile, Wainwright began his retreat to his second line of defense, so that would be D2, stretching from Zambales, which has some mountains, to the town of San Jose. On the 25th of December, supporters from the Sulu Islands were also invaded, as General Sakaguchi departed Davao back on the 23rd of December. He captures the city and its crucial airfield with little to no resistance. Now, Sakaguchi could use this location as a base of operations against the Dutch East Indies. From about December the 25th to the 28th, Manila was bombed despite it being declared an open city. Homa's forces would capture the towns of Carman, Tayug, San Manuel, and San Quintin, but they were unable to root out the retreating Allied forces, so they're unable to capture many. On the 27th, Wainwright had successfully established his second line of defense. Even in the complete disarray, the South Luzon force managed to withdraw and implemented some leapfrogging tactics to cross some bridges to reach Bataan. Now, I want to just mention one little thing here because it's an interesting tidbit of information, and it is alleged. I can't prove much of this because the way I found this information seemed to be from someone who had a bone to pick with MacArthur, by the way. Allegedly, on December the 28th, as the Japanese were closing in on Manila, MacArthur telephoned the mayor of Manila, Yoris Vargas, from Corregidor, and he asked him to purchase $35,000 worth of shares in the Lepanto Mining Company on his behalf. Vargas executed the transaction.
Mining.
Yeah. Vargas executed the transaction the next day and would later recall that this single decision during the critical stages of the Japanese invasion of the Philippines would make MacArthur a millionaire by the war's end. Just saying, it's alleged information. People might be screaming at me that this is slanderous. Alleged information again. On December the 28th, the situation was deteriorating rapidly for the defenders of the Philippines. The implementation of War Plan Orange 3 had come far too late, leading to a disastrous withdrawal to Bataan. 75,000 troops comprising, as I said, 15,000 Americans, 60,000 Filipinos, along with all the refugees. They were lucky if the majority of them got there, but certainly their war materials were not going to all get there. And
not to mention
quite
supplies.
disorderly. Yeah.
I mean, what's the point of being besieged if you don't have food?
Exactly.
Just saying.
Now, by December the 29th, the Japanese had now secured the towns of Tarlac and Bagobon. On the 30th, General Homa began to comprehend MacArthur's strategic movements. And he's starting to understand what they were doing, that they're running to Bataan. So he dispatched the 7th Tank Regiment as a vanguard to try and swiftly capture critical bridges and junctions leading into Bataan, thus aiming to cut off the retreating American troops and the civilians. The 7th Tank Regiment was directed towards the vital road junction at Paredel, just due north of Manila, where the twin steel bridges of Calumpit, which is over the Pampanga River, could be attacked. It was essential, actually, for the Southern Luzon forces' passage to get to Bataan. So Parker's forces needed to cross over from this bridge. A couple of well-placed bombs on these bridges would sever the lines of communications for the Northern and Southern Luzon forces. Wainwright's third line of defenses eventually fell, leading the Japanese to capture San Miguel. Now, Wainwright was compelled to establish a final line of defenses stretching from Fort Stolzenberg to Sibyl Springs. If the Japanese breached this last line, San Fernando would be exposed to an attack where countless civilians were
So,
actually still fleeing
so
for their
deep
lives.
five.
Yeah. The 7th Tank Regiment approached Gaipan, merely a short distance from this last line of American defenses. By the 31st of December, the 7th Tank Regiment broke through this final defensive line, getting within proximity to Balang, situated just before Parendel. Concurrently, the Japanese forces were pushing past the breach defenses towards San Fernando. Now, Wainwright was forced to make kind of a stand in San Fernando, or else he risked the Japanese cutting off Bataan from the remaining fleeing forces. One second. Now, the Southern Luzon force under General Jones, because let's remember he was actually tagging in for Parker, they reached the Cannon-Put Steel bridges, and while his forces were crossing them, he dispatched 2 tank platoons to engage the Japanese tanks at Balang, hoping to provide enough time for his defenders to get over. The American tanks managed to destroy 7 Japanese tanks without sustaining any casualties, successfully delaying their advance. Because, let's be honest, despite the fact the Japanese have many tanks, they're not quite good tanks when compared to other tanks, such as the Americans. At this moment, if the Japanese air forces had struck any of these bridges,
Maybe they're better than the Italian tanks.
actually, that would be a great episode. If Japan and Italy did fight during World War II, and that is going to be a future episode I'm going to do. It's a weird story. But anyways, if their
Amen.
Fiats attacked the Honda tanks, it's a battle of whose tanks are shittier. I think the Japanese would still win, but I would have to look into it. But it'd be a fun episode.
Yep. I don't think the cappuccino machines are still winning.
They're not going to probably pull through that one. The U.S. tanks, as I said, they managed to destroy a lot of these Japanese tanks. They kind of push them back a little bit. But during all of this, if the Japanese Air Forces had destroyed any of these bridges, it would have cut off an enormous amount of retreating American forces and Filipinos. By January the 1st, the IGA 48th Division, leading the advance, understood the urgency and they appealed to Japanese air commanders to start bombarding the bridges. However, this request was dismissed, possibly because the air commanders knew most forces had already crossed at this point. On that same day, the Southern Luzon force, having successfully moved everyone across the bridges, detonated the structures behind them, thus avoiding what could have been, a catastrophic entrapment of their entire force. By the 2nd of January, Japanese troops entered Manila unopposed. Storefronts were boarded up, gangs of local looters exploited the chaos, as crowds of civilians stood by silently.